Hello and welcome to our next study together in the topic of unshakable faith. I hope the Lord is taking good care of you. You've been in my prayers, and I hope that I've been some in your prayers. And so we want to talk some more about the great deeds and accomplishments of men and women that were recognized in Hebrews chapter 11 for having exceptional faith. We talked about this as being kind of a hall of fame for people that have exceptional faith. And, last time we talked some about Abel and how his act of obedient faith and worship, for which he paid with his life, by the way, unfortunately, qualified him to be in the Hall of Fame. And for Enoch's walk with God, a lifestyle of consistently following God's will, enabled him to escape death. You kind of wonder, hey, God, did you notice that Abel got killed, got murdered at, a young age, evidently by his brother, and Enoch never died at all? He just went to heaven with you. Is that really fair? And so, the Bible doesn't answer a lot of these thorny questions we have about life, but it doesn't dodge them either. It just says it's there, and it recognizes the fact that we live in a very imperfect world with a lot of jagged edges, but it doesn't answer all of our questions. Well, today we're going to talk about a married couple who were outstanding in the fact that they had a long life that was full of a lot of jagged edges. But if there's anybody that deserves to be in the Faith Hall of Fame, it's Abraham and Sarah. So if you want to stop the video right now and make sure that you have a Bible, something to write with, some paper, maybe if you got the email, you could print out the handout that I made up to go along with this lesson. If you want to just pause the video, get that stuff together, sit down, relax, and we'll study together. Okay, so if everybody's ready to go, I want to talk a little bit, a review about the case of Noah that we talked about last time. Only one verse about Noah, and it talks about him having something the Bible calls holy fear, or some translations say reverent fear. What is this fear? Fear, a lot of times in the Bible, is condemned, and it's kind of like the opposite of faith. But that's bad fear. Holy fear is, at least here in Hebrews 11:7, is described as a good kind of fear. In our day and age, we have pushed back really hard against the idea of being afraid of God. We've pushed back really hard against hell. Yes, that's right, hell. In fact, if a preacher wants to preach a moving sermon, and by that I mean that he'll be forced to move to get a new job, not that the audience will be moved. He just needs to preach a full sermon on hell and eternal punishment, because people do not want to hear it. The book of Hebrews, a lot of people say it's written like a long sermon. It's 13 chapters, and it's a word of encouragement, of exhortation. People really discouraged about their Christian life because of persecution. And so the Hebrew writer talks to them about the fact that Christianity is a better covenant than any place that God has spoken to him through his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom he created the universe. But he's not afraid to stick in things about fear. He talks about our God as a consuming fire. It's a terrible thing to fall into the hands of the living God. He says we're not of those who shrink back and are destroyed. And so he commends Noah for this holy fear, this fear of the flood, frankly. And so he acts out of faith because he trusts God, that God's promise, but also God's warning is true as well. He took God very seriously about something not yet seen. We talked about how a lot of us are, hopefully all of us, are taking seriously something, warnings about something we can't see, a virus. But imagine how hard it would be if we had to do that with no visible evidence and no social support. If our family were the only ones that were taking this warning seriously, how hard, that's what it was for Noah. And so we mentioned that last time, and that's why Noah's faith gets him into the Hall of Fame, in my opinion. So today we're going to talk about Abraham and Sarah, and the Hebrew writer says one reason they had such great faith is they had a long-term vision for their life. A lot of times people talk about how they live paycheck to paycheck, and that is they spend almost all the money that they make. You can say that that's because of a lack of discipline or because of necessity or whatever. Anyway, they live, it's just, if I could just make it to the next paycheck. And so that's kind of their focus. But Abraham and Sarah had kind of a lifetime focus. And the vision that they had was that they were going to a special city. They were going to a special city. And so I wanted you to think with me about your dream city. If you could pick the nicest city to live in the whole world, where would that be? Now, some of you may say Oxford. I hope you do. But, maybe it's someplace that has a more ideal climate, not quite so hot in the summer. Or maybe it's a place with beautiful, gorgeous scenery at the foot of, the Rocky Mountains or the Alps or something. Maybe it's a place where your grandchildren or your children or your grandparents live, a place where you can be very close to friends and loved ones. Or there's something else that would make that city your most ideal city to live in. Maybe it's based upon some memories you have of a time you used to live there, and it just seemed like ideal to you. Well, this is Abraham and Sarah. They spend their whole life in between. And right now, we're going through this quarantine, this virus thing, and we reassure ourselves that someday this will be a memory, that this is a time in between. We'll remember things before the virus, and then there'll be a time after the virus. And this strange time we're going through right now will just be a time of transition, a time of in-between. But Abraham and Sarah, because of their faith, lived almost their entire life in that period of in-between. So, question 3 on your handout, and I hope you did print out the handout that I sent you, it's list some of the details that the main facts about Abraham and Sarah's life. I know a lot of you are good Bible students, and you know a lot about Abraham and Sarah. They're certainly big characters in the Bible, both Old Testament and New Testament. And Abraham is viewed as a major figure in the Jewish religion, in the Christian religion, and even in, as I understand it, in the Muslim religion, Islam. So he starts off in modern-day Iraq at a place called Ur of the Chaldees, and a very nice city by our standards. And God says you need to leave. You need to get away from this culture, get away from your family, your father's house, and go to a place I'll show you. He doesn't tell him where he's going. He says, you just need to go. I'll tell you where to go when you get started. So he gets started. He ends up living like a nomad in the land of Canaan for the rest of his life. He does make a foray or two to Egypt to get away from a famine, but ends up back in Canaan. Sarah and Abraham were challenged by the fact that they could not have children until very late in life. They had one child, a son named Isaac. So because of their example of faith, Abraham and Sarah come up again in the New Testament. Can you name some places in the New Testament where we read about Abraham and Sarah? Well, there are 26 books in the New Testament, and if you just start naming books, you actually you'll probably hit a lot of them that mention Abraham and Sarah, and his name, Abraham in particular, comes up in the Gospels. The preachers that preach sermons that are recorded in the book of Acts mention him. But in addition to that, he's really big in the book of Romans and in the book of Galatians, where Paul spells out his theology of how a good God can save sinful people. And he says it's all about faith. And Abraham is presented as Exhibit A because the Old Testament, the book of Genesis chapter 12, says Abraham believed God and God credited it to him for righteousness. And Paul seems to be making the point that God didn't change the rules in the middle of the game. He didn't say, okay, Jews, if you want to be right with me, you got to follow all these laws. But, oh, now that Jesus has come, forget all the laws. It's all about faith. And instead, Paul says faith is the foundation of righteousness, of a right relationship with God, going all the way back to Abraham. And he cites Genesis 12 as evidence of that. So we also hit Abraham really hard here in the book of Hebrews, and we're going to talk, that's what our lessons are from today. And then the book of James also struggles with this idea of how much action is required to manifest faith, or is faith something that totally occurs, between your ears? And so so the only point I'm making here is that, Abraham crops up everywhere. I mean, he's everywhere you look in the Bible. He's big, and certainly deserves to be in the Faith Hall of Fame. In fact, and if you've been in my class, I've emphasized this before, Abraham and Sarah are described as being spiritual ancestors of everyone who tries to follow a life of faith, everyone who is living by faith. It says the real children of Abraham are not Jews. The real children of Abraham are people who are living by faith. Makes this point a couple of places in the Bible. So, even though you may not wear one of those special little caps like Jewish people do, you may go out on Saturday and work. You may not go to the synagogue. You may not think of yourself as Jewish. You are a child of Abraham if you are a person who is justified by faith. And so Abraham and Sarah are our spiritual ancestors. Now, one other thing that emphasizes about Sarah, in contrast to Abraham, is in the book of 1 Peter, I believe chapter 3, she is cited as an example for all Christian wives because of her courage and her submission to her husband. It says she called him Lord and obeyed him, and she comes across in the entire account of the Bible as a very strong woman, but one who bought into this vision that Abraham had of a great city as their destination. We'll come back to that in a minute. So our lesson for today is drawn from Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 through 12. Now, if you have my handout, you will notice that I have this scripture in a box up in the upper right-hand side. And you will also notice that usually on my handout I have a title, and then I have a heading that says Review, and then I have a heading that says Today's Lesson. I'm having trouble keeping it together, and there's no heading here that says Today's Lesson. Okay, so I don't know. Anyway, we're to today's lesson. So let's just read this together. You can look in the box, or you may wish to get out your own Bible and read in your own translation and kind of follow along. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to a city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was unable to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and him as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and as countless as the sand on the seashore. Well, one of the great things about Abraham is that, and Sarah, is that they waited patiently for God to fulfill his promise. It says in Genesis chapter 15 that God took Abraham outside and said, look around you. To the north and the south, to the east and the west, all the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. Go walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you. Now, if you've never been forced to leave a place where you're living, if you've never been completely without any kind of roots, any kind of place that you can say, this is my home and I will not leave until I'm ready, you can't appreciate what this kind of promise meant to Abraham, because he lived like a nomad. If maybe when you're in school, you study the life of the Bedouins in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia in particular, people that live with camels and they live in tents and they have goats and sheep and so forth. And so this is the kind of lifestyle that Abraham and Sarah lived. They moved from place to place with their herds. They were very wealthy, but at the end of the day, they laid their head down inside a tent because they had to move from place to place. It wasn't there weren't any cities. It's that God did not give them a place to live. That culture in those cities was something that they were told to stay away from, and they did choose to follow God's commands and stay away from it. I remember several years ago, many years ago, I had a kind of a long visit one time with older brother Irvin Davis, who is the father of our elders, current elders, Durward Davis and Dale Davis, and many other kids in that family. But anyway, he told me kind of what it was like to grow up as a sharecropper down in Texas. His family was poor. His mother and father were poor. And they lived in, very humble surroundings. One time, actually, a house that was a tent or partly a tent. And it wasn't their land. And so when he came to Mississippi and was able to buy a piece of land, what we now call Davisville, that meant so much to him. And he made huge sacrifices to hold on to that land through hard times. And he had to sell a little piece of it one time, and that was, to him, a tragedy. Because it meant a lot to have, for his family to own a piece of the earth that was theirs, and it was their home, and they would hold on to it. So God makes this promise to Abraham. But get this, God didn't say you can have this 10 acres, or like me, 1.3 acres, which I think is kind of nice, 1.3 acres. Isn't that great? He said, everything you can see, north, south, east, west, it's all going to be yours. But guess what? Abraham never got any of that land in his lifetime. The Bible says the only land he ever owned was a burial place for him and Sarah and their family. It was, in fact, a field with a cave in it, and the burial place was in the cave. That's the only land he ever had title to. So how does Abraham in his mind say, I know God promised me all this land, but it's not happening for me. It's not happening for me. And it says here, verse 9, by faith he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. God says this is your land, but he's a stranger all the time. It never is his land. And so this to me is it's almost an irrational faith, but it's a very, very strong faith. Then in the case of in the next verse 10, the Hebrew writer kind of explains how this was done. And we make a big mistake here, and I think Les made this point really well in the lesson that he taught in our course a while back, is that we think, well, you know, the way that Abraham and Sarah were able to do this tremendous feat of faith is they were just superhuman. They were like Olympic champions, you know. They were like Yao Ming, 7 foot, 4 inches tall, or they were like Carl Lewis, you know, who can run like the wind. They were like, you know, some of these other great, fantastic athletes. And so we really shouldn't compare ourselves to them. No, they did dumb things. They had periods where their faith was weak. They did sinful things. They lied about, if you read the whole story, their lives were kind of messy, as a matter of fact. But here's the thing. This is the way they were able to do this. And in verse 10 about Abraham, it says, "For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God." The cities that he came to as he traveled from place to place, living in tents in the land of Canaan, he would say, well, this is not the city I'm looking for. I'm going to a city. I have a destiny. I have a goal. I have a vision. But the city that I'm going to is a city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Revelation 21 talks about heaven being this city, this new Jerusalem, and the foundations it talks about being made of jewels, and it's just a fantastic picture. So what I want to suggest to you is this metaphor that this city is a metaphor for our ultimate goal, for heaven, for the kingdom of God, for the place we are going. Now the question is, why does the Hebrew writer and other writers in the Bible use a city as a metaphor for Abraham's goal, for living ultimately with God? Why a city? A lot of times, I think we're very tempted to think of our home with God, that is our ultimate goal as Christians, not as a city, but as a mansion or a hotel. And we will have a very nice suite of rooms. We will look out on beautiful scenery, and God will be on room service. Anything we want, we press a button, he comes right up and delivers it to us. And the nice thing is, except for servants, nobody else is there. It's just us living in God's mansion, and boy, is that nice. But the Bible, the writers of the biblical books talk about a city which is a community. It is a dwelling place. It is a place that it says God is the architect and builder, and I meant to do this before I taught this class. I went to look up and see, is this the only place that the word architect appears in the Bible? You can do that for homework. I will too. God working as an architect. I'm a great admirer of great architecture. Okay, and certainly the Hebrew writer, whoever that is writing during a golden age of architecture. A lot of the buildings on campus, like the Lyceum, imitate the buildings that were around in the first century. Some of them designed and built, in the years before the first century. But this was an age of great architecture. The Greek temples, the Roman buildings, and so forth. But it says this city. If you think it's great architecture, you ought to see this city that Abraham is headed for, the architect and the builder. Great architecture is no good if you got a lousy builder. The architect and builder is God. It is a community. It is a place specially designed for you and me, and we're not there alone. And certainly during this period of epidemic, social distancing, quarantine, we begin to see how keenly a community meets our needs. We realize that, first of all, we've got to work together to overcome the epidemic. Everybody has to, participate. If everybody doesn't participate, then we can't stop the thing. The other thing is how much we miss our coworkers, our family members, our grandchildren, our grandparents. So a city, that's the metaphor that's used. Imagine what that meant to Abraham and Sarah, that they were headed for a permanent address. no longer living as nomads. There are several places, as a matter of fact, in the Old Testament and the New Testament, where that ultimate destination for the faithful, that ultimate relationship with God, is described as a city. And so I'm going to let you do this for homework. It's question 10 on your handout. It lists 4 of these passages. The last one, Revelation 21, I've got verses 2 through 4 there. Just read the whole chapter. Boy, it's a great, great description of that city whose architect and builder is God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. Most beautiful city you can imagine. And then it talks about how the chief resident of that city is God. His dwelling place is with men, and he wipes every tear away from their eyes. Well, one issue that Abraham and Sarah had to overcome, and we're going to get into this more in some of our later lessons, but is the fact that God promised them a big family. In Genesis 12, verse 2, very first command, God says, leave your culture, leave your father's house, and go to a land I will show you. And if you do this, I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you. Then after he left, he got the promised land. Genesis 15, God says, go outside at night. He said, go outside and look up. Count the stars, if indeed you can. So shall your offspring be. And Abraham believed God, and God credited to him as righteous. You are going to have a big, big family. You and Sarah are going to have a big, then no children. No children, no children, no children. And so a keynote of Abraham and Sarah's faith is patience. And this is highlighted in Hebrews chapter 6, verses 13 and 14. It says, he waited patiently for what God promised. Patience is really big in our lives right now, isn't it? It's hard for us to be patient when we are in this time of transition, when we are facing irritating circumstances, when we feel like God is not answering our messages, when things are not working out for us in our life the way we had supposed. What a huge challenge to faith that is. Does God really exist? And if he does exist, does he really want the best? Does he care? Does God care at all how things work out in my life and in your life? And so this is a great challenge to our faith. Now, here's interesting. Let's talk about Sarah just a minute, and then we're going to wind this thing up. In verse 11 of our text here, Hebrews chapter 11, and by faith even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. Notice there's two uses of that Greek word pistis that we talked about in our first lesson, faith. It says by faith, and then she considered him faithful. Not the exact same form of the word, but it is the root of both of these words in the original language. And so faith is confident hope, expectation on Sarah's part by faith, and she considered him faithful, and that is trustworthy or reliable. You can count on him. You can give him your paycheck, and he will take care of your money. You know, he will take care of your baby if you have to step away. You know, this is somebody that you can trust. And so she considered God faithful who had made the promise, even though no baby, year after year, no baby, no baby, no baby. In fact, some translators say that we don't translate this right. The by faith Sarah is not by Sarah's faith. It's by Abraham's faith. And it has to do with the original language, and I'm not a Greek scholar. I'm not going to try to skate on that thin ice right here. But they say the faith here is Abraham's faith, and it says that she considered him faithful, should be he considered him faithful. Because if you go back to Genesis, when the messengers from God show up and say, you know, about this time next year, Sarah's going to have a baby, she starts giggling. She's listening in from the behind the curtain in the tent there, and she gets tickled that she said, you know, me and Abraham, we don't do that anymore, and you know, these guys this is ridiculous. Somebody my age have a baby. She laughs. We would say she's cynical. But she's so full of doubt. She's so lacking in faith. She thinks this whole thing is ridiculous. And then the messenger, which is called the Lord, then the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, will I really have a child now that I'm old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son. Sarah was afraid, so she lied and said, I didn't laugh. But he said, yes, you did laugh. And so that was Genesis 18, about verses 12 through 15. Then we go to Genesis 21. This is on your sheet. After the baby's born, Sarah, still she can't get over. She said, this is wow. Here I am so old. I'm 90-something years old. I'm having a baby. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age at the very time God had promised him. And Sarah said, God has brought me laughter. And everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. So this is happy laughter. At first it's doubtful laughter. Now it's happy laughter. And so they named, to make sure, God says, you're going to name this kid Laughter because you were laughing. You thought it was so funny. So his name is Isaac. So every time you call his name, you think about that laughter. So how do you think Sarah arrived at faith when she was initially so skeptical? I want to suggest maybe she had just a little bit of faith. Maybe she had just a mustard seed of faith. The disciples said to Jesus something that's in my prayers a lot, and said, Lord, increase our faith. And basically, instead of saying, okay, I'll increase your faith, now you've got more faith. He said, well, you really don't need very much faith if you'll use what you've got. It just takes a mustard seed. It just takes a little teeny bit. It just takes a tiny bit of faith, and you can do great things. I'll leave you with that thought. I appreciate your participation and our study together. I apologize for the technical difficulties that you have sometime, and I know I'm not, a TV personality or anything. I really commend you for joining in, and I hope that you'll continue to study this topic of unshakable faith with me.